talk about imagination, because I did read your book, Lifting the Veil, Imagination in the Kingdom of God.
Yeah.
And why is it so important for us to even cultivate and talk of this imagination? What's it such an important question for today?
I think we have to begin by clearing up a common misunderstanding. Because we use the word imaginary to mean something completely made up and not the case, we can sometimes think if people talk about imagination, or as Keats said, the truth of imagination, they think we're just wishfully thinking that stuff we make up might be true. And that's not what we're doing. We just have to say that at the outset. Now, once we've said that, we can then say, but isn't it interesting how in a play or a story or a piece of art or music, you get a form or shape or a pattern which suddenly allows you to understand and realize and be moved by all kinds of really true things. You know, the story of War and Peace or Les Miserables or Hamlet or anything, you know, might be made up stories, but everybody who's been there, in the way some of those characters speak, everybody's felt, at least at some part, you know, what Hamlet felt when he said to be or not to be. That is the question, you know. Everybody knows what it is to love someone and lose them, and be forced apart by parental politics and a kid's, you know. And when Hamlet says to Ophelia, nymph in thy orisons, be all my sins remembered. Okay, there isn't a person actually called Hamlet, and there isn't you know, but that moment of bitterness and parting and confusion, when suddenly out of nowhere, Hamlet the doubter asks for his ex-girlfriend's prayers, that's real. Yeah,
it is.
And so we notice that there's all kinds of truth going on in Madame. But then Coleridge and others notice that, in fact, if you think about the senses, you know, the materialist picture is that all the data, if you like, all the streams of, you know, sensation come in through the windows of the eyes and the vibrations of the ears, and are somehow printed on us, kind of as they are, as though we were, as the old people said, a tabula rasa, a blank table. Now, serious thinkers began to realize that couldn't possibly be the case, because, or it couldn't be just that, because you've got to make sense of the stream of information that's coming in. You know, to use I don't like using computer analogies, they're limited, but to use one briefly, you're being asked to process millions of bits of data all the time. But how do you turn that into knowledge? You know, how out of all that stream of stuff do you shape a human face, or see a star, or make a distinction, or see perspective, or judge, you know, between appearance and reality? All those are active powers of the consciousness, you know, or the soul. And Coleridge in particular thought the imagination as a creative power that's able to make beautiful links and see connections and think up metaphors was the power in the soul which took the raw sense data and actually actively, imaginatively helped to shape a proper sense of what's there and of how it coheres and what its significance is. Now, the great breakthrough for Coleridge, I mean, I don't know how deep you want to get into the philosophy of this, but you may know that you know, there were two kinds of dualism at work in the so-called Enlightenment. One was Cartesian dualism, where Descartes had said there are only two categories of existence. There's res extensa, which is all that stuff out there that has dimension and shape, and that's just dead matter. So he said, I mean, he was wrong, but it's what he said. And then he said there's res cogitans, thinking stuff. And he thought thinking stuff was non-material, and that we had it, and God had it, and angels had it, but otherwise it didn't exist. So there was pure material, which had no purpose or meaning. And then there were our minds and God's mind and angels' minds. And of course, the next generation said, well, why do we need God and the angels? They're not making any difference to anything. Let's jettison them. And then a couple of generations later said, well, maybe we haven't got minds. Maybe it's all just chemical. Yes, it's all childish. That was one dualism, right? But there was another dualism about how we know. And the great propounder of that was the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant pointed out that everything we see, what he calls the phenomena, the appearances, are appearances that our mind shapes. But what is actually out there in its raw state, if you like, unshaped by the perceiving mind and the particular set of lenses ground in the way they are that we happen to have, as opposed to being, say, insects. He said we can never know what the real thing is out there. We can only know what we've perceived. And he made the distinction between phenomena, which is what we think of as the world, and noumena, which is what might really be there. And that's a hell of a chasm to live with, you know. So we had these two big splits, you know. Now Coleridge wasn't happy with either split, but the Kantian one, he said, Kant's got a point. There must be something in us that deals with the data, discerns its meaning, finds out which are the significant bits, puts them together, perceives beauty, perceives the sublime. That's not passive. That's not like a piece of photographic paper doing that. There's something more going on. But Coleridge said, actually, this is a kind of primary imagination. But the great breakthrough for Coleridge was when he was thinking these thoughts and then finally getting around to rereading the Gospels and reading particularly the prologue to John's Gospel, that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And all things were made from that. There's this mind in God, this Logos, in whom and through whom and with him all things are made. And then, of course, John says that he is the light and light that is the life of man. And then he says, he's the light that lightens everyone that comes into the world. Because as he reads later in Genesis, and of course, John is partly a riff on Genesis, it begins with the same words, as you know, because we are made in the imago Dei, in the image of God. So Coleridge began to wonder whether this inner deep power of imagination was part of the image of God in us. And finally, in Biographia Literaria, published in 1817, he wrote that famous passage in which he says, the primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, not just making stuff up, perception. And then he could have left it there and people would have just debated it along with Kant, right? But he says the living power and prime agent of all human perception. Then he goes on to say, and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. Just at the moment, because eternal is a very important word, the act of creation is eternal in the sense that it's not part of a temporal sequence. He got this from Augustine. You may remember famously in Augustine's Confessions, towards the end of the book, he has a meditation on Genesis. And he reads these beginnings. There's the beginning of Genesis. He says, in the beginning, in principio, as it would have been in his Latin text, in the beginning, God created the heavens and earth, and the earth was without form and void. So Augustine says, well, what does this word beginning mean if it's prior to creation? Because surely time itself is a created thing. As he says, anticipating Einstein, Augustine says, God did not make the world in time, but with time, creates time and space in order that there should be a world. So strictly speaking, the act of creation is not in the order of time, it's eternal. Now, the order of time has beginning, middle, and end. So there's a beginning, whether it's a Big Bang or whatever you want to think it was, which is also the beginning of time. But the true beginning is in God, who is eternal. And in that sense, you and I right now on this Zoom call are as close to the eternal act of creation as, you know, the first star or the first human beings, because eternity is equally related to every point of time, as C.S. Lewis says in the Screwtape Letters. The present moment is the point where time touches eternity. The present is all lit up with golden rays. So the eternal act, from our point of view, is always going on. Now, what Coleridge is saying, I think, and this is mind-blowing, is that there's something of God, a reflection of God, because we're made in his image, in our perceiving and shaping imagination as we make sense of the world, which is actually reverberating with and connected to God's beautiful and loving act of speaking it into being and making it in the first place. And that's why Coleridge said that the Newtonian image of the world as a mechanical thing operating by laws and like a piece of clockwork, and God as a creator who kind of created the watch or the clock and wound it up and is now retired to an infinite distance, you know, paring his fingernails while the world runs down. That's deism. That's not theism. That's not even remotely Christianity. But he said that's just a false image. He says if we want an analogy for the relationship between creator and creation and us as perceivers, glad perceivers in praise of the beauty of creation, then he says it's much more like a text. In fact, that's what the gospel says. Genesis says, he said, let there be light, and there was light. It's utterance. John says, in the word, all things were made. So that at least invites us to make an analogy. And Coleridge uses the analogy of poetry. He says, when a poet writes a poem, of course, it has to have a physicality. It exists as a text on a printed page. But the page by itself, flat in the book, unread, is not actually a poem. It's a series of squiggles and black marks. The poem only shimmers into being as a poem when the mind of the poet and the mind of the reader meet through the reader's discerning the meaning and beauty of the images in the poem. Then the poem, if you like, shimmers into being as these two imaginations meet. Now, of course, the mind of the reader is guided by the mind of the poet who's made the poem, but the mind of the reader has to be active and imaginative to get the poem. So what Coleridge thought was that God's gift of primary imagination in all of us allows us to perceive his world. But he thought that since the Enlightenment, we had actually created, we're not reading God's poem, we're fashioning an idol of our own. We've got this fantasy that it's a piece of clockwork or a computer mechanism, which has neither philosophical nor scriptural foundations. Instead of letting it be what it is, the second book, as it were, of God, that he's given us his book in the scriptures, and he's spoken his word into the world. So I found all that as I began to read it in my early years as a Christian, hugely exciting. And I still find it hugely exciting. Now, Coleridge goes on to say that what we think of as the imagination, like the creative imagination, the poetic imagination, the imagination that let him write the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, or let Shakespeare write Hamlet, or, he thought that was like the primary imagination in that it was really creative. And Tolkien went on to speak of it as subcreation, and that it was a special privilege of us among the creatures of God, that like our maker, we too could be makers. And that if we were to make well with a kind of baptized imagination, deeply reading what God has already given us, we could make beautiful and lasting things which might themselves embody truth. And one of the things that I suppose I've particularly done when I was excitedly rereading the whole works of Shakespeare in light of my new Christian faith, or re-remembering them, I knew a lot of them anyway, but I was so excited when I read the beautiful passage about poetry in A Midsummer Night's Dream, where you get this description of poetry. You may remember, it's very famous, where Shakespeare says through one of the characters, it's actually through a character who doesn't like poetry, so he gives the best lines to a kind of hostile witness. But anyway, Theseus in Midsummer Night's Dream says, "The poet's eye in fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothingness a local habitation and a name." And that little speech is it's framed both before and after by sentences which talk about two ways of knowing: apprehend and comprehend. Earlier, before that description, the character says that imagination apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends. Later on, he says, if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy. So I began to think there was something beautiful going on between this heaven, earth, earth, heaven, apprehend, comprehend. The idea that it's something that's really true, but you can't get it because you haven't got a form or a shape for it. But imagination bodies forth the forms and things unknown. It gives to what is real but unknowable a knowable and lovable and holdable and nameable form. So I got that far before my conversion. But when I reread that passage as a Christian, a little more deeply soaked in the scriptures, I was saying, what does this remind me of? This whole kind of earth, heaven, earth, apprehend, comprehend, invisible, visible. And right in the middle of it is this bodies forth and local habitation and a name. And I suddenly thought, oh my goodness, this is exactly like the prologue to John's Gospel. Because you remember in John's Gospel, it goes, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the same was with God, and all things were made through him. And you read it, and this is terrific truth and philosophy and wisdom and mystery, but you can't see it, can you? Kind of the words just going around like that in the top of your head. And then finally you get to verse 14, and it says, and the word was made flesh, bodied forth, made flesh, and dwelt among us. And we beheld, we actually saw in this world with our eyes in bodily form, we beheld his glory, glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And I suddenly thought, now that's astonishing. I think Shakespeare has framed the account of his art in which all the possible meanings, which we could never quite get, coalesce and are given a body in the form of the story or the play or the poem. And then we can comprehend them, we can enter into them. But maybe we can only do that because God, the maker, and you know that the Greek word for to make in John's gospel is poiein. It's the word we get poet from, you know. You could say he poeted, everything was poeted, that was poeted, and without his poetry, there was no poem, you know, be another way to translate it. So what if God, the supreme being and the meaning of all things, looks at his creation and says, if I stay up here disembodied and wordless, you're never going to get this. What if I was to take the whole of heaven, the very heart of my love, the very core of who I am, that I want to communicate to you, and body it forth, make it flesh in a person, all of me for all of you, but now with a shape and a name and, of course, a local habitation. I mean, the first question, I mean, Shakespeare would have been working with both Latin and English Bibles. The first question of the disciples to Jesus in John's Gospel is, Master, where are you staying? I mean, Magister ubi habitas, where is your habitation? And of course, John has that partly because he's riffing on Genesis. And the first question from God to human beings in Genesis is, where are you? We were hiding from God. We've always been hiding from God. And then we made this stupid idea that God was really hiding from us. And they had this idea, the Deus absconditas, that God is not there. And God said, no, let me make this clear. You are the guys are hiding and I'm going to come. But if you want to say, where are you? Here I am. And of course, before Abraham was, I am, you know, the infinite I am. So I began to see a parallel between the best account of poetry by the greatest poet and the most glorious account of creation in the, you know, in the most mystical gospel, and realized they were really talking about the same thing. And that perhaps we can be creative and we can trust our creative imagination because we have a God who creatively and poetically bodied forth all of heaven in the body and person of Jesus.